panel discussion today is Exporting to Asia, Design and Tourism. We're going to be looking at diversity of Asian culture, what is trending in Asia, designing Asian projects in Australia, and bridging the gap between Australia and Asia. What are we doing? Are we making it a smooth transition between design and design process? To start the panel discussion, we'll start with Dave from Ovolo Hotel, which will be more of an owner-operator perspective. And then we'll have 5-minute each presentation from each of the panel members, and then we'll have some question and answers. So welcome, everybody. So Dave, Ovolo Hotels are extremely successful brand. You've now own and operate 4 hotels in Hong Kong, and you've got 6 hotels in Australia. Can you provide an overview of what the Ovolo brand is and what the target market is in Australia, and whether that's similar to the target market in Hong Kong?
Sure. Ovolo Hotels is an independently owned hotel company with headquarters in Hong Kong. We currently operate 10 different hotels, 4 in Hong Kong, 6 in Australia. Relatively new hotel company. Majority of our hotels are very unique from each other. Really independently appointed hotels in unique locations. A lot of heritage components involved, but I think the key factor is we're not trying to repeat ourselves and creating a unique hotel experience each and every time we acquire an asset. We are a little different from majority of the hotel operators, where we actually own and invest in our own hotels and also operate them. The traveler is, we're really reaching out to the modern traveler. It's not much different between Hong Kong and Australia for us. We're really looking after the need of a modern traveler, which is really same, doesn't really matter where you are in the world.
Yeah, so just focusing more on the tourist market rather than localised for Australia and Hong Kong. So you've been very active with recent acquisitions in Australia, such as Brisbane and Canberra. Could you tell us a bit more about that, what you recently acquired and what the key drivers are behind that?
Last 6 months been pretty busy for our team. We entered in Australia, I'll take it probably a step back. We entered in Australia in 2014 when we acquired Woolloomooloo and the Piedmont Hotel, 2 big hotels in Sydney. We put a lot of effort to get those 2 hotels right and position them correctly in the marketplace. Those 2 hotels are number 1, number 2 in TripAdvisor and very much loved by the travelers in the Sydney market. And I think it was time for us to further grow. In last 6 months, we acquired 3 different hotels. So it's been a pretty hectic work for my team and a lot of work with beautiful designers. Many of them are present here today who are working on those projects. We acquired Inchcombe Hotel in late last year, which has been refurbished over the last 6 months and repositioned as Ovolo Inchcombe in Brisbane. We acquired the Hotel in Canberra, which is a beautifully appointed hotel already. We're going through a small subtle changes to make it Ovolo, just to give it a look and feel slightly, but it's a beautiful hotel, so it don't need to do too much in there. It is renamed to Ovolo Nishi, and the final works in relation to repositioning will finish in the next 2 months. We acquired Emporium Hotel in Brisbane. That's the picture. It settled last week, and we named it Ovolo Valley, and we're going to go through a 6-month of refurbishment plan in that hotel to call it Ovolo the Valley towards the end of this year.
Wow, that's amazing. So, I mean, Ovolo, is there any reason why you chose Australia rather than any other Asian destination? Like, why invest more in Australia?
Yeah, the brand started in Hong Kong, and when we looked deep into our customer segment, Hong Kong has primarily the international travelers, and we realized that the Australians love the hotel, maybe because of the free Wi-Fi and free minibar we provide, I don't know. But I think it was very obvious when we looked into the market segment and our travelers, we realized Australians absolutely love the hotels. And I think it was relatively easy to work being the 2 Commonwealth countries. So when we decided to step out from Hong Kong market, we decided to come to Melbourne, actually. The first hotel for Overlook Group was in Melbourne Laneways. It's a small 43-room hotel in the Little Bourke Street. If you haven't had a chance to go there, please go and have a visit. It's a beautifully appointed lifestyle hotel. That was the first experiment. It was very well accepted by the market. We positioned ourselves beautifully in the segment and decided to take it further, and now we have 6 hotels.
I mean, it's a very fun, artistic, flexible brand. I mean, you only have to look at TripAdvisor to know how successful it is. In terms of the approach and hotel design style of Ovolo, it appears a bit inconsistent across the hotel portfolio with Australia and Hong Kong. Why is this?
We don't really have a big brand book or a brand documentation which we hand over to designers to say build around this. I mean, we have a very simple approach. I mean, we acquire assets and we then design it according to the local needs, to what actually works for the building. If it's a heritage building, it needs to be taken care of and given its due respect, and in the local environment where you're in. So we try not to repeat ourselves. My usual brief to designers, which is not much help, is do something fun. And we refer to fun as fabulous, unconventional, and never boring. So we try not to always look back into what we've done previously. Obviously, some aspects are brand promises, the brand promise, and you need to keep those brand promises. But when it comes to design, look and feel, and the vibe of the place, we always trying to push the boundaries and look for something new. I call it, we are consistently inconsistent. So we giving something new. Every time you walk in an Ovolo, you'll find something new, and it's not the repetition.
Yeah, it's keeping that element of surprise and interest.
That's the way to create a guest experience. I mean, of course, as a guest, you want to go to the hotel and you want to be able to access those basic facilities we all require, and those needs need to be met. But at the same time, you also need to feel, you need to feel excited when you walk in a hotel. And if you're repeating yourself again and again, which many of the brands do, is efficient and effective, obviously, to make it work. But when you're going to a 100-room hotel, it's boutique, it's service-oriented. You really want to be, seeing new things all the time. And it's amazing. Those people who love Woolloomooloo, they absolutely love Woolloomooloo. And those who love 1888, they love 1888, and they don't like Woolloomooloo as much. But that's okay. As long as we have enough number of people who are falling in love in each and every of these hotels, we are fine.
I mean, and it's got a great marketing overlay as well to go in hand with the design. I guess in terms of selecting a designer, what's your usual process to select a designer for particular sites?
Don't really have one way to do it. I think we've selected designers various different ways. Sometimes it's just being comfortable with who we worked with in the past, and continue the journey with them. But I think it really comes to individual product, and we connected with lots of designers. We obviously go around and meet people internationally as well as in Australia. And when we look at an asset, when we have a vision in mind as to what we want to do with it, you can easily shortlist those 2 or 3 you have had a coffee with or drink with in some other meeting or some conference, or you worked in the past, and you go very much like, okay, I'm going to work with those 2 or 3 and pick one of them to work with. So far, we've been lucky. I think we have had an opportunity to work with some amazing designers and some amazing teams, but that's usually how the works come across. As an example, I met Bronwyn in Inchcombe lobby for a quick coffee 3 months ago, and we were talking about Emporium as a new designer to appoint, and she was my first pick to start talking to. We did talk to a few others, and that's for Emporium, and that Bronwyn is from Woods Bagot team. Sorry, I should have mentioned. But it was an easy decision. We didn't go through a big tender process. We just appointed 2 different companies to come in, pitch for the business, and went ahead. But at the same time, we realized that we wanted food and beverage to be something unique and something new to the market. So we reached out to Averroco in New York to design the food and beverage concept.
And as part of that process, do you also look at having the designers potentially interpret your brand as part of that selection process?
It's definitely a requirement, but I think we can go through the journey, and whenever you work first time with a team, you'll always need to work hard to communicate what the brand is all about. But the fact that we don't have a very big document which explain you what the brand is, what the brand standard is, we're not the easiest people to work with. I know all my designers who work with us. We kind of go round in circle till we find the right answer. And at times, as a team, we don't know what the right answer is. We just keep asking the question till the time we get there. So we're kind of painful people to work with, just warning. But it's a fun exercise, and we always come up with an amazing product in the end. I think that's the only thing matters.
Exactly. I mean, would you also consider Australian designers in Hong Kong for your Hong Kong assets?
We haven't done that so far, but there is no reason why it can't be done. I mean, we have used Australian designers to do majority of the hotel work in Australia, and we have used Singapore and Hong Kong designers to do work in Hong Kong. But we're now much bigger in Australia than in Hong Kong, so maybe there's an opportunity for Australian designers to go back and work in Hong Kong. But we're looking for more expansion in Asia as well, and I'm sure once we go in the Asian market, we'll probably tap into the Australian designers because we feel comfortable with the teams who work here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you would have spent a fair bit of time establishing relationships and everything in Australia as well for them.
That's right.
Yeah. So in terms of design process, you've refurbished a number of Australian hotels. How have you found the design process? Is that different to Hong Kong?
Process is same. It just takes longer in Australia.
Yeah.
Hong Kong is fast, very fast.
Yeah. So would that be attributed to population and labour costs? Or
it could be. I think in Hong Kong very quickly, Hong Kong as a nature is just a fast-paced city, and the turnaround is much quicker. The expectation of the market is to have quicker turnaround, dedicated teams. Anything gets from concept to completion is probably half the time of what it takes in Australia. It's also the requirements, the processes to get approvals and other things. Like we're not builders. We primarily have done in the past is acquire an existing beautiful hotel and then reposition and refurbish it. So in those processes, the delay is not necessarily due to DAs and everything. It's primarily just the process. So Hong Kong is just fast.
Okay. And in terms of the Ovolo design, I know you said you didn't have a big guideline book, but if you do have some sort of guide, do you tailor anything for the Asian traveller in that brief? And is that something you'd brief the Australian designers with?
No, not really. I mean, we are aiming as a hotel company for for a modern traveller. There is really the needs are very, very similar. So within our hotel group, simply because of the target market we are going after, we don't need to do that. I understand that if you're targeting specifically FIT traveller from Asia, then you need to design accordingly. But those design needs are, in my view, are no longer any different to what it's very similar as a target market. Unless you're going for a group business from Asia, then your design needs are different. Otherwise, it's very similar. Yeah, right. Well, look, you've raised some really interesting points there. Specifically, the market is more of a tourist market, and that in terms of design process, things happen a lot quicker over in Hong Kong. And also that the design is becoming more generic, and it's not actually tailored to necessarily the Asian culture. So thanks, Dave. I think we might hand it over to the panel members now to each present their 5-minute presentation, and then we'll have some question and answers. So first off, we have James Campbell looking at cultural diversity in Asia.
Thanks, Melinda. I might need the button for the presentation. Hi everybody, a little bit about myself. I work for DWP, Design Worldwide Partnership. We're in pretty much every Asian country, including Middle East, and I've worked for them for 10 years. My background is 30 years in hospitality and 15 years of that working in Asia and Asian projects. So I guess that's why I've picked this subject, one continent, many cultures. it's a big subject to do in 5 minutes. So I think I've tried to narrow it down to at least 4 main points: social status or wealth, religion, cultural pride, and education, as sort of the 4 main points that have an impact on how we, I guess, run our businesses, run our consultants' business in Asia, and how we design hotels. So we'll start with wealth and social status. This is a pretty broad subject, but it's more about you'd strike this in more of emerging markets in Asia. So it's generally a common factor across most countries in Asia. Wealth is generally concentrated in usually small family companies, well connected to the government. They're usually run by the head or the family or they're called chairmans. Relationships are very important in Asia. It's important to gain the relationship with the chairman. This makes the project run smoother, ensures obviously you get paid at the end. Aspiration is also a fairly large part in Asia. We've got a fairly big emerging middle class coming. A lot of those countries are going from, we're going from a third world country to a first world country. And there's a lot of aspiration around, I guess, social status and showing that you have this new required wealth. And that underpins a lot of success of, I guess, a lot of high-end bars and clubs within Asia. I've put some examples here of, I guess, projects we've worked on. You've got clubs. DWP is very known for its sky bars. We've done numerous across Asia. This is Sirocco in Bangkok, and then this is Chill Bar in Vietnam. So these places are definitely... To drink in these places there's a bit of a status similar. They're not a cheap place to get drink. In fact, most of them are probably the most expensive cocktail you can have in these cities. So these are sort of what I'm going to show you are sort of samples of what these key subject matters we're talking about today. The other point is religion. This has a big impact on definitely designing in the Middle Eastern countries and in the Buddhist countries. So, as I said, the 2 main religions of Asia are Islam and Buddhism. I guess unlike Western Christianity, they very, very little shared values between the 2. And they have lots of impact more on, I guess, the hotel planning, on how you lay out a hotel. I've done projects in Bangladesh and in Dubai, and Islam, there's a lot of customs that you have to take into consideration when you design those hotels. The separation between men and women, especially when you come to function rooms, and then obviously prayer rooms and things like that, and how you display alcohol is quite critical. So, and then you've got the more Buddhist countries like Thailand. Of course, there's a fairly large Buddhist population, which is a little bit more westernised in its approach. So a big difference between the 2. And then you've got the Chinese part, which is a little bit more Taoism. I find that China, as compared in the past, is sort of becoming a little bit more, not religious, but a little bit looking back to its past in a way. So feng shui is quite a big part of that principle that you need to always consider when you design in China, depending on obviously the client, but still a fairly big impact. So just some examples here of prayer rooms in Dubai. Obviously, we'll have to face Mecca. A project we did in China. This whole resort is based on feng shui or Taoist principles of laying it out, very strict. Quite a challenging project if you're a Westerner working in China and your client wants you to learn basically feng shui and lay out his resort for him. So quite a challenge. The third point is cultural pride, and this is what I find a changing aspect of working in Asia, where once before you kind of had a cultures that wanted to be more westernised. They wanted to have, they went to Europe, they came back, they wanted to recreate that feel. And now what I'm seeing is that there's much more cultural pride in working there, especially in countries like China. It's much more nationalistic than it was before. When I remember working there in the late 90s. So it's changing. Brands are have to change the way that they work in those markets. There's much more brands that are now more allocated just to the Chinese market. And then, of course, as all designers know, that when you design in these places, most of these hotels have to have a strong sense of place. It's quite important, especially with boutique hotels, but even now the bigger brands are changing. They're no longer kind of cookie cutting the brands into those places. I remember the Marriotts, they used to it was basically the same Marriott you checked in America, it was, in Seattle was the same Marriott they opened in Beijing. But it's changing now. So some examples here of hotels which really have a strong cultural sense of place. This is the DesignInn Resort project. And then I've done multiple projects in Vietnam. Most of these projects have to have a very strong connection to its environment. This has a Vietnamese street food concept. Hotel d'Arts has a very strong Indochina concept to it. And then the last point, it would be, I guess, education. Education is changing, but generally if you're working in a third world country, like I spent most of my time doing in Vietnam, for example, you're dealing with, everyday aspects of working, running an office where you have staff, the ability of staff to do the work. They're very undertrained and the technical ability is low. So it's a challenge to run those offices, almost like you're running a school in a way. And then there's the level of education of the client, which has an impact on the way the project is run. Some clients are educated, like you do in Thailand, and some clients are not educated, and that becomes a challenge with working on projects. They tend to micromanage, things like that. So this is all changing, like Asia tends to change. It's one thing it's definitely a known there. And it's definitely education, one of those points that really is moving from where it was, say 10 years ago.
Thanks, James. I can definitely relate to the relationship part. That's quite interesting, and we can talk about that when we come back for questions. So we'll pass on now to Catherine Love, who's going to be looking at what's trending in Asia now.
I'm just waiting for the show to come on. Okay. So I'm going to contrast what's happening perhaps in Sydney, this is what was known as Wanda 1, and what is happening in Asia. And I remember when one of our directors came down from Asia, he said, why is it that Sydney does things more in squares and rectangles, or variations of, and in Asia they tend to be much more organic? And I think a lot of our clients are saying we want organic sorts of projects in Asia. These are some of the people that we are working with. And where the red dots are is where we're mainly working. So I've lived and worked for 3 years in Shanghai, Hanoi, and now Beijing. So our main offices are 3 in China, 2 in Vietnam, and our Sydney office. And these are diverse thumbnails of the projects that we've been working on over the last amount of years. So I'm starting with that comment that one of our directors made about the difference between Sydney and what happens in Asia. This was one of our earlier Novotels. I think this was done. It was on the drawing boards when I was there in 2010. It's a pretty, referring to our previous speaker, yes, I think there has been a great change in what's been happening with the clients in Vietnam. One of the things that it depends which country you're in. For instance, we did the water cube in Beijing, and this creates a lot of interest to our clients up there. There is a much greater interest in technology, I'd say, when we're working in China. There's a great deal of interest of the technology that we've got in Sydney from having worked on One Central Park as the executive architects. So quite often when we're showing capabilities, these heliostats and the landscaping over this building quite often is influential in what they want to see in their hotels, which brings us to perhaps in China and in Vietnam, I'd say that one of the biggest interests are about having healthier environments in your hotels, and that falls under that broad spectrum of sustainability. So it can be talking about sustainable culture, sustainable landscapes, healthy environments in terms of food and beverage as well. So this seems to be something that captures the imagination of who we're speaking to. So then this gets translated in some ways to some of the hotels that we're dealing with. This one's in Vietnam. And then that point about the change in national pride. In Vietnam, this is an example of a room in the Mercure that we did in Vietnam. And the Vietnamese have an amazing culture, and they have an amazing history of arts and crafts. So bringing in their textiles, their ceramics. In this one, I love this one because they're actually bringing in the ceramics on the floors, their work in cane work, etc. You really do feel as if you're in some of the smaller villages. You go and visit the villages when you're in Vietnam, and the villages are dedicated to ceramics or dedicated to silk or dedicated to textiles, and so you get this experience right in the room. These are this is the Novotel interiors. This was done at least 10 years ago. So even then, there was this interest in please show us things that relate to our culture. It used to be Lotus, things like this. This is the spa in the Novotel. Again, in the Mercure, using the local technologies. That's, of course, culturally sustainable. You're employing the local craftsmen, and it makes it the unique experience in the hotel. Then there are also in Vietnam, for instance, there is the understanding, aside from that we want to celebrate the local culture, it's understanding the skill and expertise of the people who are building. And until very recently, that really was just concrete. So you had to find sculptural ways to deal with concrete, and the hotel sizes were quite large. Speaking to the concept of education as well, this is one of our latest master plans. They're huge developments, but this one's based all around the notion of marshes, wetlands. And so this was the mangroves, and it was about, they don't own the beach that's looking beautiful up to the left-hand side of the screen. They own the mangrove, and now it's more about we want to have the night tours, teaching the families about life generated from mangroves. But this is a huge difference of scale. That's the main difference, I think, of working in China to working in Sydney, is the enormous scale that can be happening there with their development. So this is obviously mixed-use development. There's a hotel there, but there are service departments, etc. I know later on there's some questions about perhaps working with Koreans, and this one is a mixed-use development that we're doing in Vietnam. It's an interesting, if we do pursue that one, it is an interesting way of working with the Koreans. They have a particular way of doing their business, and how that translates when they work in a different culture. And I'm just going to end off with two other slides. If you remember the Wanda One at the beginning, which was a very sophisticated urban development that they were the executive architects on, then this is one called Octopus, for perhaps obvious reasons, picking on the local culture in Hainan Island in China. This was the first non-gaming offshore development that Caesar's Palace wanted to do, 800 plus keys, but they wanted the grand, we talked about luxury, they wanted the lobby to be a water lobby. Complete with water restaurants underwater, subwater restaurants, aquarium restaurants, etc. But this somewhat unusual, iconic architecture was developed out of the tribesmen's fishing tools that they were using for fishing in the local hills. So and this one has not gone ahead at the moment because of the political changes that have been happening in China. But even speaking to that cultural pride, it was very much evident and growing from, say, 8 to 5 years ago. And that is, I think, one of the main things that is happening, this national pride and wanting to celebrate their minorities and their craftsmanship. That's a closing slide of the octopus, which is much more the huge contrast between the opening slide and the closing slide. It's much more parametric, but then also using prefabrication as the technologies to be able to build it.
Thanks, Catherine. And it's so great to see that sustainability is getting more and more integrated over the last few years, so that's great. So we'll just pass on now to Jonathan Conroy, who's going to be looking at designing in Australia for Asian hotel projects.
Because I like to make things hard for myself. I don't have slides, so I need to give you something to look at while I speak. So I was still fairly green as a designer when I took my first international business trip. And on my first morning, and I was preparing to go into my first meeting, my mentor at the time, who was about to head off to his own meetings, said to me, keep them off their toes, change the subject. And that was the totality of his advice to me. It was a fairly no-frills kind of mentoring. But the thing that he could not have prepared me for, and I was fairly well-travelled at the time, but I don't believe that, I believe that only experience can prepare you for, is the amount of cultural work that you do when you go to a business meeting in another country. And so while I went into that meeting with an expectation that there would be a certain amount of, a certain number of hurdles to get over in terms of language difficulties, some different terminology, perhaps even expecting some level of cultural difference to deal with, what I didn't expect was that actually the vast majority of my energy in that day, in that first day of meetings, was expended on cultural translation and trying to get a read on who was who in the room and what was happening in the background. And you very much take for granted, I think, the amount of work that you do unconsciously when you're working in your own culture. And that really is a starting point for thinking about the kinds of things that we need to do as designers if we want to work as Australian designers in Asia. And the first cab off the rank really is about what the personal challenges are as a designer. And the key one really is about building the ability to build and maintain relationships across that project over a great distance, over the cultural and language barriers that you face, and bearing in mind that you will probably only, for the first 6 months of that project, see the project team on 2 or 3 occasions. You may not even see them that often. So there's a very particular skill set that you can develop to make life easier working in long-distance design projects. And one of the other personal skills that really needs to be refined is the ability to manage stakeholder expectations across cultural differences. And it's something that James touched on in his presentation in terms of the conversation around whether or not owners were educated, and that tends to be a bit more of a transcultural thing. You find that owners who are first-time owners of hotels tend to have a very, very different approach and a much more, for want of a better word, problematic approach than owners who have built and or renovated and bought hotels before. But if you then add on top of that a whole number of cultural differences that need to be negotiated, the fact that you do not get FaceTime with those people, and a face-to-face meeting is really the best venue to try and get an understanding and bridge the gap, but you don't get those. You need to develop ways of doing that. At a business level, the challenges that Australian firms working in Asia, a really basic one is staff retention. People who don't get to see the projects they're working on, don't get to go to project meetings, and don't get to see the end result, tend to get a bit frustrated with that. So you really need to be able to find ways to compensate for that with your staff. Otherwise, they will look around the corner and see projects where they can walk in every day and progress their professional development in a way that isn't happening on your projects. And you also need to, on another level as an Australian designer, you need to be able to manage the expectation of your Australian suppliers. We as designers are dependent on suppliers in a whole number of ways, just at the basic level in terms of getting hold of samples, but also in terms of getting someone to work with you to get their product on a project and get an understanding of how best to achieve that. And one of the things that you need to do on an overseas project is really be realistic about the chances of that product actually getting used. And if you don't manage that relationship and manage those expectations, you'll burn out suppliers very quickly. But the biggest challenge really of working on long distance projects comes at the end. It's the challenge of maintaining the design integrity through the construction process, because through the design and documentation process you can control the conversation as you need to through communication. You can connect with people. In the construction process, things start to move very quickly, and you'll all know that from your own experiences. You need the construction process just takes off and goes ahead on its own in its own direction. In Australia, or if your project is around the corner, you can duck around the corner and have a look and see what's going on and get your eye on what kind of things are not being done in the way that you would like. But you don't have that luxury working on a long distance project, which takes us back to the first point about building relationships. You need to make sure very early in the process that you establish some very, very good relationships so that there are people on site who can give you feedback, and reliable feedback, on what's happening during the construction process. So to succeed in these kinds of long-distance design processes, you need discipline and efficiency in the way that you work. And then you need to go the next step and consider that your design needs to be articulated in a way that can adapt to a whole range of different regulatory or statutory and or systems and construction methodologies. So a lot of the processes that you would quite comfortably use in Australia simply don't work overseas, because there are different, on one hand, different regulatory standards that you perhaps don't need to cover, and on the other hand, and more importantly, everything is done in different ways in different countries. There's always some slight variation on how a particular thing is done, and if you spend your time redesigning to suit that, then there's a real inefficiency in that. But if you acknowledge that from the start and get the right pieces in place at the start of the project, you can then go on and design with a flexible process that allows someone locally to take what you've done and adapt it to their needs, to their construction needs. And one of the other things you need is an international view of the service cultures that you're working within. And that's something that I'll touch on a little bit further along. In terms of, and I've always enjoyed working on overseas projects, I have to say, a lot more than working in projects in Australia. And it's really just because there are a number of things that you can do on those projects that you can't do on a project where you're very close to the project management team and the other consultant team. And one of those One of those key things is, it touches again on the earlier point about how little time you have, how little face time you have with that project team, and the need for you to be disciplined and efficient in that time that you have with them. The flip side of that coin is that you actually get a bit of a buffer in your design process to just go away and get on with it without a granular examination of what you're doing from week to week. And no one can blame project managers for wanting to do that. It's their responsibility. The reality is that there are poor designers out there who can't do what they claim to do, and project managers are ultimately responsible for making sure that the client's needs are satisfied. But speaking as one of the designers who can do what they say they can do, it's really great to be able to have that buffer and not have that examination. Although people obviously do, there are ways that people do that, and you need to remain accountable to the project manager, and that again is about those relationships and those trusts. But you really do get a very different start to the design process on a long distance design project.
Jonathan, I think we're running over time slightly, so we might just have to, if any final point before we go back to James.
So just in terms of the competitive environment, clearly labour costs are lower in Asia, so there's no real benefit charging in and trying to compete on labour, but you can harness that, and there are many Australian design companies that open offices in Asia. But the one big advantage that Australian firms have over firms out of Europe and the US is a time zone alignment with Asia, which allows us to have efficiencies in terms of communication with clients and project teams, but also travel efficiencies as well. You can really get a lot of value out of the travel that you do for projects. And so I'll just quickly go back to something that I touched on earlier, which is the importance of understanding service cultures in the countries that you're working in. And I think you can broadly describe the Australian service culture at its best as warm and genuine. And I would say that, notwithstanding the variety and the number of variations across Asia, you could broadly describe Asian service culture, when it's at its best, as seamless and refined. So they're two very different things, and you need to understand that when you're working on projects in Asia, because my fundamental belief and position on hospitality design is that what we are designing is a vessel for a hospitality experience. And really, if you don't take the time to understand what the service culture is, then you're not really engaging with the product that the client is trying to make. And part of the process of understanding what the service culture is folding that into the design, because that will inform operational decisions and that will inform guest expectations as well. So really, the best hospitality design comes from an understanding of the service culture that the hotel will be offering in that country.
Thanks, Jonathan. So just going back to James and look at cultural diversity in a bit more detail, you touched on a few influences such as social status, religion and education. If we look at social status a bit closer, does this mean typically there is more demand for Asian clients to aspire to building luxury hotels?
Thanks, Melinda. Yeah, I think it's changing. I think a lot of Asian clients now are getting much more realistic with return on investment. That was not like that in the past. Hotels were built, it was because it was much more, let's say, ego-driven. Chairman wants to create something that is a reflection of himself. So that's changing. And I think we're going away from more of that 5+ star, 6-star hotel, and more of the 4-star, 3-star hotels are being built throughout Asia, because they're finally realising that you need to get return on investment. So that's the big change.
Okay. We might just open up a question to the whole of the panel. I guess, has anyone come across any challenges working on multiple hotel projects for a particular client across many Asian countries? So one client, few countries, few hotels. any challenges with managing that client?
Look, I think the main challenges are things that we've already touched on earlier, which is really it's very much about what the mix of owners is for that client. And again, you really in projects where you have an experienced owner who has realistic expectation of what they want out of the project, it goes very well. But that's universally true. It's not specific to Asia.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and that's the reality, is that in working in hotels, there is that two-way dynamic or three-way dynamic between the designer, the owner, and the operator, and the big variable in that is often the owner.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as an Australian designer, you can help facilitate that process and understanding as part of the design brief as part of that process.
I think that, say in Vietnam, the presence of the owner cannot be underestimated. The owner could go through 4 operators, and he will, and again, it changes, say, from northern Vietnam to southern Vietnam, and where that owner has been educated, often in Russia. So the impact of the owner in Vietnam still, for, say, we've just recently topped out a Radisson Blu and a Movenpick there, the impact of the owner is tremendous. Mm-hmm. It is, he wants his ego or his input to be strongly put onto that project. So even though, say, Radisson Blu and Movenpick might have the thick documents, it's a very strong negotiation that happens through the project. Right.
Okay. Well, look, I think we'll probably have one more question on this particular, looking at diversity. If there's any particular countries from your experience that try to stay true more to their heritage rather than, if there'd be any others that would be considered more Western design orientated and other countries that stay true to their heritage. Are we seeing more of that now? Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. I think it's the older school that are wanting to stay more Western oriented, and it's the more innovative hoteliers that are wanting to have this pride in their culture and in their local environment and celebrate the craftsmanship. And that's actually a really exciting development that's happening in the hotel industry.
I'd just like to add to Catherine, there's a massive variation between Asian countries. You've got a country like Singapore, Hong Kong, they're pretty much Western countries. Yeah. You've got countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, and they're still way back in progress. So it really depends on which country you're in. Thailand, you wouldn't think it, but it's one of the most advanced countries and most easiest countries to actually operate in as a consultant, because they know the service industry. You're dealing with second or third generation owners, not first generation owners. Right. And that's the big difference when you're trying to being a consultant in Asia.
The hotels are coming, we're there to provide some unique experiences. So wherever you are, I think that's kind of a change is coming. And I noticed the comment I made, which was that we don't have a brand standard document, which no hotel or IAG may have. And you very well said that that's changing. There is a document, but then there's an open brief along with it. I think that's a welcoming change to the industry, that it's not about just replicating what has been successful in the past, but respect the culture, respect the local experience, because that's why people are there. That's why Airbnb and models like that are successful, because you go and live in someone's house and you get to experience that rug which is sourced from locally, and the example you gave with beautiful tiles on the floor, that's amazing. That's bringing the heritage back to the hotel, and that's the reason none of our hotels are same. They're unique, they're different, because they're celebrating what is there to celebrate in the local proximity, the culture, the building, heritage. You have to find an angle and make it bigger, so you create an experience which is unique. And I think that's why people travel, and that's where the direction is. So if you're in Vietnam or Cambodia or those culturally rich countries, there is a lot more opportunity to do more than simply building a square building and just creating what is, there's no point going in a hotel room in Cambodia and you feel like you're in Manhattan. That's pointless in my view. Anyway, I don't have a hotel there, so I can't comment too much.
Okay, so Catherine, we might just go back to looking at what's trending, and specifically for hotel rooms and food and beverage. What are we actually seeing now coming out of Asia in those particular areas?
I think it's the desire for health in all its aspects. So it starts with having clean air. I've just come back from Beijing. And that goes all the way through. Last night we were talking about how Overlo's just opened up here's a plug.
Plant-based restaurant.
Yes. So it's going all the way through that health, both in the food and beverage, and just the getting to that clean, safe environment, that you're getting the cultural experience and that you're getting the technologies there that are hidden. I think that, for instance, I'm not, or we're not at the moment involved with any of the robots as your welcoming committee or as your room service, even though some of our operators, one of our clients is telling us that is very big in Japan, for instance, but it's certainly not happening in Vietnam, because it's still about wanting to get that connection to the culture, to the people, and that connection to healthy food, healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, funny you mentioned Japan. There is a hotel called the Henna Hotel, which is manned by robots, and it has robot concierge, cloakroom, etc., keyless entry, facial recognition. So it is there. It's just how much do we think of that type of technology are we going to bring back to Australia?
Well, in the hotels that we're dealing with in Australia, it's not yet here. I'm not sure whether it is going to come. We were talking last night about a concept that maybe I'll leave for Overlo to develop.
Tesla Hotel.
Whether there's going to be a Telstra hotel as a car that's mobile. I don't see that happening in the short term. I think it's more about the people, the service to the people, and keeping the human experience. Even though I'd go to that Japan hotel once, I don't think I'd go, because for me personally, and I think most people are still wanting that human connection.
Okay.
I think there's a need for both sides to develop unique experiences. Is one way to develop the one chain, and there is plenty of demand for that. And automation and fast tracking is another way to go, and I'm sure there's plenty of space for both of them to grow. I mean, if there's going to be a hotel which is manned by robot, serviced by robot, it has to be in Japan, right? So,
exactly.
So it's a new trend, and I'm sure it'll find its way into Australia at some point.
Look, we're short of time now, but I'd just like to say there's been some really interesting perspectives here today. But what we'll do is we'll just open it up to the audience for any questions before we wrap up. Oh, right, okay. Okay. Okay, the question is, prior to starting a project, how do you gain an understanding of any existing relationship between owners and suppliers?
Sorry. If we're talking about Vietnam or China, PTW have been in these markets we've actually had our offices there for 20 years, and it is about relationship. It's about that trust. And so, and as long as you've got that trust, then it's an easier opening. So the days of the fly in, fly out, I think, are not taken as well as if you've been there through the thick and thin in their country with them and you've gone through the tough times and stayed. I think that's why we get the projects that we're getting, because they know that we've been there even when every other firm has left the country. We've stayed there, and that holds water.
Well, look, we have run out of time, but I'd just like to ask if everyone give the panel a round of applause.